guys, today's video we are going to start Mendelian genetics. Our first focus is going to be relating to monohybrid crosses. So this is our topic 1. So before we start looking at the Mendelian and specifically how we cross DNA genetics, we need to kind of look at the concept of selective breeding. So selective breeding is where you are choosing traits or choosing mates that you would like to mate with. So the example that we give here was, in quotations, accidental selective breeding of wheat began as early as 9000 BC in the Middle East. So what farmers were able to do is that they were going to choose wheat with the strong characteristics that they wanted to farm and grow, and they were going to look at breeding that specific wheat with those specific traits. Now, looking forward at our current time is that through genetics, we've been able to take advantage of selective breeding, leading to the development of new variations of organisms with desirable traits and behaviors. So a lot of the times the example that I would have given in class would be about dogs and breeding purebreds. So you are choosing to breed like a labradoodle. You are choosing a lab with a poodle, and you were looking for qualities and characteristics of both a lab and a poodle. So here are some other examples. We look at farming, we look at crops, we look at specific species. But when we look at this, this is a really good example of what we will look at and what we'll understand as this unit progresses. So in the first row, you have a black horse and a white horse. But in this first example, it's giving you a black and white spotted horse. But if we look at the bottom example, we are looking at a black horse, a white horse, and one of the offspring is a brown horse. So we were going to look at is, why does this happen? Why are we having two options of offspring? And as we move forward with our genetics, we're going to understand more about the specifics. Okay, so genes, alleles, and traits. So these are very important and key terminology that we need to know. So traits are determined by specific genes or segments of DNA. Different variations of genes are known as alleles. Okay, this is important. You need to know that for your notes. In most cases, one allele is dominant over the other, influencing the way such genes are expressed. So the allele that encodes for brown eyes, for example, is dominant over the allele that codes for blue. Okay, so this bottom part here is when we look at what's dominant, that is the trait that is kind of going to, it's not necessarily more common, it's the trait that's going to be prevalent when we look at these crosses. So in this case, this individual, okay, and if we look at these different alleles, this person has to have a big B, and it doesn't matter what letter we use, you guys, but we know that it has to have that dominant one. So if brown is dominant, we write that as a big B, could be two big B's, or big B and little b. Now, where did that little b come from? Well, this individual has blue eyes. I've told you down in this example is that blue eyes is a recessive trait. So the only possible combination of these alleles for this individual with blue eyes would be two little b's because they are recessive. Now, as we progress, I'll go through a little bit more of the terminology of the dominant and recessive, but I did want to flag that example to you guys here. Now, very important terminology, the difference between phenotype and genotype. This means that although we receive genes from both parents, our characteristics are not determined by the blending of our parent traits. Rather, for the trait, for example, eye, hair color, etc., we express either the maternal, so that's from mom, or the paternal phenotype. So when we look at the definition of phenotype is how a trait is physically expressed. The example I give, phenotype and picture, they both start with a P. So a phenotype is how would you describe that trait if you were to see it in the picture? For example, having blue eyes, and that relates to the slide before. Now, genotype is the combination of alleles for the given trait. So the genotype is, these are our letters. So if I stick with the blue, I would describe the phenotype of a person with blue eyes with the actual word blue. But if I were to describe the genotype of an individual with blue eyes, I would represent that by two little b's. And I'm going from the information off the previous slide that determined that blue was a recessive eye color. Okay, a little further into more of this example. So in this case, we are showing an example here that this part encodes for brown eyes. Now the word brown is phenotype. The big B, the letter itself, is your genotype. Over here, this part of the DNA encodes for the blue eyes. Blue is representing the phenotype. Little b is representing the genotype. So this child's dad's donated an allele encoding brown eyes. So that means the trait of brown eyes came from that paternal source. Her mom donated an allele encoding for blue eyes. Because the brown allele, big B, is dominant over the blue allele, or little b, her eyes appear to be brown rather than blue. Now there are cases where maybe an offspring might have blue eyes, but we're relating to this specific example and the fact that child does have brown eyes. Okay, so some terminology. The characteristic that is expressed is controlled by the dominant allele, represented by an uppercase B. The characteristic that is represented is controlled by the recessive allele, represented by the lowercase b. So going through the dominant trait, that is the one, not the most common, but that is the trait that is more dominant. That if it's paired with the recessive allele, that phenotype is going to come out over the recessive phenotype. Now, looking at allele combinations, if traits are influenced by the interaction of two alleles, one from mom, one from dad, and one allele is always dominant over the other, how many potential allele combinations are there for each trait? So, looking at this, and I'll go over this a little bit more in detail, but looking here, big B and a big B. That means that this individual is going to have two big B's. Now, so I know we're talking about big B's, little B's, so we're going to pick some characteristics. We're going to say that big B is representing maybe blonde hair, and little b maybe is representing brown hair. We'll make it simple. So looking in this case is that when we look at figuring out genotypes, and genotype is a letter, that in order for that trait to be in a person is that we always have to have two alleles. So in this case, big B are representing those two alleles. That means, and if we go back to here, that this individual is going to have, according to its phenotype, blonde hair. We describe this when they have two of the dominant traits as homozygous dominant. Both parents will give a dominant allele, resulting in a dominant phenotype. Okay, so let's just look at this for a second. We have mom and a dad. So in this case, we are going to look at the homozygous dominant example. So we know, and I've told you, that each individual has to have two alleles. And right now, I am describing the genotype because I'm looking at the letters. Now, if both of these parents were homozygous dominant, mom, when it comes to hair color, would have two big B's. Dad would also have two big B's because that's indicated in the example that I gave. So when we look at this, we know that mom is going to give one egg. Dad is going to give a sperm. And we know from our reproduction unit that an egg and a sperm are going to come together in that fertilization. Now, when we look here, mom is only going to give one of these alleles. So each egg is going to have one of these alleles. Now, looking at mom, she has two big B's. So we know that this egg is going to carry that allele with that dominant big B trait. And looking over at dad, in the sperm is only going to get one of those traits. And in this case, it's going to be a big B. So the offspring here is going to have two big B's, and that offspring is going to be that homozygous dominant. So no matter what happens and how many offspring that these guys have, is that every offspring will have big B, and they'll be homozygous dominant for blonde hair. Okay, so now looking at the second case is that we have an individual that has a big B, little b. So when they have one dominant and one recessive trait, we use the term heterozygous. So what this means is that this individual has a blonde-haired allele and a brown-haired allele. But what this is saying is that if this individual has one of each, then one parent had to give the big B, the other parent had to give the little b. Okay? But when I look at this, I know that this individual is going to have that even though it's heterozygous, it's going to have that dominant phenotype. And if I go back to my chart here, is that I have one big B, one little b. This individual who has that heterozygous pattern of allele is going to have blonde hair. Now, coming down here, I have homozygous recessive. That indicates here that I have two little b's. So that means that this individual had to get that recessive trait, one from mom, one from dad. So that is going to indicate a recessive phenotype. So here, this individual must have brown hair, going from the example I gave. So what's really important for us to understand here is that we are still going back to reproduction. That we have to understand is that half of your genetic material comes from mom, half of it comes from dad. And this is why we did meiosis last week, so that we know that this is where the specifics are going to come in. Why maybe one sibling has brown hair but the other has blonde hair, etc. Okay, so we need to remember is that one trait comes from mom, one trait comes from dad, specifically when we look at. Okay, so moving forward is that we are going to now look at the specific of if we have parent 1 and parent 2 with these specific genotypes. And remember, guys, that is you're dealing with your letters like big B, maybe big B, little b, whatever the situation is that we are going to take those specific genotypes and we are going to look at probabilities. What is the probability that the offspring will have these traits or have these specific phenotypes? So really good diagram here is we look at creating what I will refer to as a Punnett square. So now I know it says alleles from mom, but I also referred that to as alleles from maybe one parent. Okay, it says alleles from dad, but I look at the alleles from the other parent. So when we look at this, is that by putting these traits in this Punnett squares, I'm going to get the probability of what these traits in the offspring will be. Okay, so let's give an example. So maybe I have an offspring that has big B, and I have an offspring, not an offspring, sorry guys, these are your parents. Parent 1 is big B. Parent 2 is big B, little b. And I will indicate big B maybe here is dealing with brown eyes. Little b is dealing with blue eyes. So this is where I can say, okay, alleles from mom. Maybe this is mom. Mom in this case has 2 big B's. Dad in this case has 2 little b's. So you have mom who has brown eyes, dad who has blue eyes. What is the probability of the offspring of having each of these phenotypes? And this is what we are going to do moving forward when we look at our Punnett squares, dealing specifically right now with our monohybrids. Okay, so let's look at a monohybrid cross. This is our first specific example, and we're going to go through a few in this unit of our different crosses. Now, when we look here, in mice, black fur is inherited in an autosomal dominant manner. So when we see this word autosomal, that is just indicating that it is not a sex chromosome. Okay, and that'll matter further down in this unit. And that black fur is dominant to brown. Now, when we look at this, we are choosing letters. It does not matter what letter you choose. You just need to choose letters that are uppercase and lowercase. So list the genotypes of a black mouse and a brown mouse. Okay, so let's look at this. We have a black mouse and we have a brown mouse. What the first question was asking you, so we're looking at 1A, is what are the genotypes of the black and the brown mouse? So our black mouse, we know, has to have at least 1 big B, okay, and we always have to have 2 genotypes. And we know the brown needs to have at least 1 little b. So when I look at the black mouse, I can have a genotype of 2 big B's or big B, little b. Okay, this here is considered the your homozygous dominant. This would be your heterozygous phenotype. And when I come over to the brown mice, if I have a brown mouse, no matter what, that individual has to have 2 little b's. That is the only possible genotype with the brown mouse. Okay, so now let's look at B. If a heterozygous black mouse is crossed with a brown mouse, what is the probability their offspring will have black fur and then brown fur? So look at this here. So if I look at this black mouse, okay, it's telling me that it's heterozygous, and I know I need to have 2 alleles for each of these mice. So if that black mouse was heterozygous black, I know I need to have 1 big B and 1 little b. If this mouse was brown, I know from the previous question is that it needs to be that homozygous recessive. Now, to figure out the probability of that offspring, we now are going to look at Punnett squares. Okay, so when we look at this Punnett square, I am having a heterozygous black mouse, and I know it has 2 alleles, and I'm crossing it with a brown mouse, both 2 alleles, but I know it is homozygous recessive. So when we do a Punnett square, it's quite simple. We are going to take one parent and put it on one of these axes. It doesn't matter if it's on the X or the Y. So I'm going to put the black mouse here. Big B, little b. I am then going to take this mouse and I'm going to put this other parent here. I'm going to give myself some room. So what we want to do is then look at the offspring. And I know you don't sit and say this, but I sometimes, for simplicity's sake, like to make a square. So we have 4 combinations in this Punnett square. So this first one, if I were to take this trait and this trait, I have a possible combination of big B, little b. Here I have a possible combination of two little b's. Here I take this big B and this little b here. And this last square I have a little b and a little b, and they go here. So when I look at the probability, now it did not specifically say how I can represent this probability. So if we use fractions, we use decimals, it doesn't matter. I'm included either way, but please do make sure you answer the question as to what it's asking. So if I were to say, what is the probability of having a black mouse? Okay, and this is where black is indicating a phenotype because that's describing what that mouse looks like. So when I look here, this offspring would be black, this offspring would be black, this offspring would be brown, and this offspring would be brown. So when I look at the probability of the black black mouse, when I look here, I can say 2 out of 4, okay, which we always reduce a fraction to its lowest terms. So we would say 1 out of 2. We can say 0.5, or we could say 50%. All three of these are okay and fantastic answers to give the question. So that is the probability of these two parents having a black mouse. Now, when I go over and look at the brown mouse, same thing, have 2 out of 4. Which I would reduce to is 1 over 2. We know that's 0.5, or we could say 50%. Okay, so when these two parents mate and they have mice, 50% chance it'll be black, 50% chance it'll be brown. Okay, so part C, if two heterozygous black mice are crossed, what will the genotype and phenotypic ratio of their offspring be? So if we first need to figure out what are the genotypes of these two parents. So first mouse, it's telling you it's a heterozygous black. So I need to have one big B, one little b, one big B, one little b. So once again, we're going to create a Punnett square to look at what are the possibilities of these two mice producing, what are their phenotypic and genotypic ratios. Okay, so we have a heterozygous black mouse mating with a heterozygous black mouse. So that heterozygous means that it's going to have one dominant trait, one dominant allele, and one recessive. So same thing, we are going to take these parents and we're going to put them into a Punnett square. So I'm going to take one parent and put it at the top. This other parent, okay, conveniently it's the same. Put them here. So I'm going to make a square and we're going to fill out the probability. So in this first square, okay, I'm looking at this one right here. I have a big B and a little b. In this square over here, I have a big B and a little b from that parent. Oops, sorry guys. Here I have this little b from here, okay, and I have this big B right here. And down in this square, I have a little b from here and a little b from here. So my question asks the genotypic and phenotypic ratio here. So if I look at the genotypic ratio, and that is indicating my letters. So my genotypic ratio here is I have 1, that is big B, big B. And once again, this is my genotypic ratio. 2, I have a heterozygous combo here and a heterozygous combo here. So even though I mixed up the letters, I still have 2 that are big B, little b. And then my last ratio would be this individual here. 1, little b, little b. So when I ask you for your genotypic ratio, it's like the ratio of how many cats to dogs. Or we're looking at, I guess, in a gumball machine, how many red gumballs to how many blue gumballs to how many yellow, etc. So, but we're looking at the combinations of the different genotypes. So the other thing I asked you to here was, what is the phenotypic ratio? So phenotypic means dealing with describing what these traits will look like. So that is looking at my black to brown mice. So in this case, I have black, 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 and only 1 brown. So my ratio would be 3 black, 2, 1 brown. So that is indicating my genotypic ratio. Okay, part D. Is it possible for a homozygous black mouse and a heterozygous black mouse to have grandchildren that are brown? So that is looking at 2 generations away. So let's look here. If I have a homozygous black mouse, I know it needs to have 2 big B's. And a heterozygous black mouse. So I'm crossing it with that heterozygous big B, little b. So that is our parent generation, our P1. So let's look at the possibility of these offspring. So I drew my Punnett square slightly different. That is okay. We're going to take big B, because I'm taking this first parent. I'm going to cross it with the other parent, big B, little b. So here, first square, big B, big B, big B, big B, big B, little b, big B, little b. So when I look at this, my probabilities here is that it's going to be, when I look at the phenotype, 100% black mice. But this is where things can get a little interesting, is that I have 2 mice that are heterozygous. So when the question comes, can they have grandchildren that are brown? Well, what if one of these individuals end up mating with maybe a mouse who is also black, but heterozygous. So when we look at this, same thing when I look at my Punnett square, one parent goes here, okay, the other parent went down the side. I have 1 homozygous dominant, 1 heterozygous, 1 heterozygous, and I end up with a mouse that is homozygous recessive. So going back to the question, this indicates that after parents, first generation, okay, second generation here, which we can say is F2, will and maybe could produce an offspring that was brown in color.